G7 leaders issued a stern warning today to Russia for its continued occupation of the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, just days before that Sunday referendum on whether Crimea will leave Ukraine to join Russia. In its statement, the G7 leader said this: any such referendum would have no legal effect, given the lack of adequate preparation, the intimidating presence of Russian troops. It would also be a deeply flawed process, which would have no moral force. For all these reasons, we would not recognize the outcome. And if Russia does follow through with annexing Crimea, the G7 are threatening, quote, further action, both individually and collectively. U.S. President Obama repeated that threat during a meeting today with the Ukrainian interim prime minister. But are these threats empty? What backs them up? Will further action be enough to deter Russia? Could sanctions actually backfire against the West? And what about Canada's role in all this? Joining me now via Skype from Victoria, BC, James Bezan, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. In Halifax, NDP Deputy Leader Megan Leslie is here, and in Montreal, Liberal Foreign Affairs critic Marc Garneau. Good to see all of you. Let me start with Mr. Bezan. The G7 statement said clearly that if Russia does end up annexing Crimea post-referendum there, that member states would, quote, take further action individually and collectively. Now, Canada has indicated it will not intervene militarily. What further action can this government take? Economic sanctions against Russia?
Yeah, there's still a lot of different levers that can be pulled. Evan, the Prime Minister, has been quite vocal and showing very strong leadership on the world stage on the moves that we've already taken and further isolating the Russian Federation as they continue to escalate and provoke the situation in Crimea. So we
give
will
us an idea. What's on the table? What are the options?
Well, you know, we're in ongoing discussions, and there was a G7 meeting earlier today. There is a European Union foreign ministers meeting on Friday. So everything is being discussed as to what happens, especially after Sunday. And we're really going to weigh it based upon the actions that Russia takes. If they're going to continue to go forward with this annexation of Crimea in violation of at least 4 treaties and the UN Charter, then there is going to be significant repercussions for the Russian Federation, which will include everything from economic to further diplomatic sanctions.
Okay, let me go to Megan Leslie. We know that the G7 countries have made this statement, and Megan Leslie. We know that they won't recognize the results of this referendum. However, there are questions about what you can do. In your view, what are the next steps to exercise pressure on Russia?
Well, we are in some uncharted territory here. I mean, we haven't been in this kind of situation in a very, very long time. So, what is available to us? I mean, you heard James talk about economic sanctions. You heard him talk about other diplomatic pressures that can be used. And so the big question, though, is what are we trying to accomplish? And one thing we are trying to avoid, for sure, is exacerbating the problem or escalating the problem. So anything that we do, any option that is on the table, you have to ask, will it achieve the end goal, or will it do the opposite?
Sorry, what's the end goal? I'm intrigued by this. Is the end goal to avoid escalation, or is the end goal to protect Crimea?
Certainly the end goal right now is to avoid escalation, hands down, right? I mean, that's the statement from the G7. Anything that the Prime Minister, I said, has been about, hey, let's step back here, let's take a breather. So certainly it is to avoid escalation. Now, the end goal will change, right? But you have to look at something like sanctions. So will sanctions actually get us to that end goal, or will it exacerbate the problem? And so whatever decisions are made, when you have that suite of options, it has to be done collectively with our international allies. It can't be Canada doing a one-off. It has to be thoughtful, it has to be purposeful, and it has to be together with our allies.
Okay, I mean, those are all general guidelines, and I appreciate that because it is uncharted territory. But Mr. Garneau, that said, things are, you know, as we talk about these generalities, things are moving imminently closer to a referendum that may decide the fate of Crimea, and all we're doing is outlining guidelines. What else can be done to ratchet up pressure on Russia not to recognize Crimea or take Crimea as part of their territory?
Well, it's been said already. Diplomatic efforts, for example, John Kerry will be meeting with Mr. Lavrov in London on Friday, and we'll put some things on the table there to see that whether Russia is willing to back away. But if none of this works, if annexation does indeed move forward, then it will be economic sanctions of a personal nature against the big leaders in the country, the oligarchs as well as of a more general nature with respect to the trading that occurs between the two countries. It'll be a two-edged sword. There will be a price to pay. But I think that it's very important that Canada, the United States, the European Union make it very, very clear that it is totally unacceptable for Russia to violate the sovereignty of Ukraine and in any way to encourage the holding of this referendum. So it's going to, if that happens, move towards those kinds of sanctions, and it will take a while before those sanctions have an effect.
But let's talk about those sanctions, because Russia said Western sanctions against it would, quote, boomerang back. They've threatened to disrupt natural gas exports to the EU, of which they have a lot. Some experts are saying the only way to weaken Russia is for Europe to boycott Russian gas and for the U.S. to put its own shale gas to market. The problem is that would take years for shale gas to get there, and that might not be the most plausible plan right now. And indeed, there's some U.S. laws about how much gas they can actually export on that. What's your view on the impact of sanctions?
Well, for Russia, it is a two-edged sword as well, because an enormous percentage of the country's revenue comes from the sale of gas and oil to European countries. So it may decide, well, we're going to cut off your supply, but it will also be cutting its nose to spite its face. So despite all the rhetoric that is going on now, once the sanctions begin to build up, if that is indeed what happens, and hopefully it won't be the case, I think at some point somebody is going to say, I give. And from obviously the West's point of view, they hope that Mr. Putin will back away.
Mr. Bezan, G7 leaders are saying they won't recognize the outcome of the Crimean referendum. But if the vote takes place, if Crimea, quote, and I say this all in quotation, chooses to secede. Now, there's a complicated history on that peninsula, as we all know, a long relationship with Russia. It's not necessarily a black and white issue. Nonetheless, nobody deems this referendum to be legal outside of the Russians right now. What do you think happens after we reject that referendum? What's the next step?
Well, I think that, you know, it all comes down to what President Putin does and the Duma. If they continue down this path, they're going to get further isolated. You know, the reason that this referendum is illegitimate is not only because the Ukrainian Constitution doesn't recognize it. It's not only because there's military troops from Russia marching up and down the streets intimidating the voters. It's because there is no electoral commission, there is no voter list, and there's no observation from international observers. So without any proper monitoring, without having a proper mechanism, there's no way that this can be a proper referendum. And we know. But
what happens if it goes through? I mean, I appreciate the difficulties in associating any kind of integrity with this referendum. Nonetheless, if it functions as a kind of papering over of the Russian intervention, what next?
Well, that's when I think you're going to see some pretty strong statements coming out of both the G7 from Canada and from the European Union as to what targeted economic sanctions may be coming forward, as well as increasing travel bans and possible further isolation from other major international organizations that the Russian Federation prides themselves on participating in.
Megan, let's say I want to come back to you on the de-escalation. Everyone talks about it. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
What can the West, what can the EU, the G7 put on the table to de-escalate now? What do you do to Russia? Do you give them guarantees? Do you say Crimea is an independent land? What do you do? Because the Russians already parked their fleet there. The Russians already own property there. Fundamentally, Russians weren't under any kind of threat at all in Crimea. They want something. What do you do without appeasing Russian expansionism?
I'm just going to say it, Evan. I don't know. And the reason I don't know is this is such a fluid situation. Last week I was in my office, which is not in Centre Block, it's a building a little further away, and by the time I walked to Centre Block, where the House of Commons is, the situation had changed. We don't know. It is so fluid. It is uncharted territory. And so there are people who have been working on this for years who know the situation well, and they can't even make predictions. Professional diplomats can't make predictions about what will happen or what we should do. So it's very fluid, and we just need to stay on top of it. We need to make sure that we're not escalating, and we need to be sensible and work together, like I said earlier, with our allies. But we don't know what's going on in Putin's head. What is going on in his head? We could not have predicted that there would be troops in Crimea, just a few weeks ago. So it is incredibly, the ground is shifting even as this interview is being done.
All right, I got to leave it there. It is incredibly complicated, and as someone was saying, it's very difficult necessarily to ascribe rational action to all things that are happening here when you're dealing with some leaders. But what is the strategy behind it? We don't know. James Bezan, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. In Halifax, NDP Deputy Leader Megan Leslie, and a Montreal Liberal Foreign Affairs critic Mark Garneau. I appreciate all of you as we watch as this referendum deadline approaches very, very, very quickly. Thanks, all of you.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, Evan.